It is 2:47 in the morning. You are not asleep. You know you should be. Part of you has known that for the last 3 hours. But here you are, still sitting in the same position, the same blue glow on your face, the same low hum of the refrigerator in the background, and somehow the night feels strangely comfortable, familiar, like a room you keep returning to even though nothing good has ever really happened inside it. Maybe you told yourself you were going to finish something, a project, a plan, an email you have been putting off for 4 days. Maybe you did not even have a reason. You just stayed up. And now it's nearly 3 in the morning and you're watching a video about what staying up all night does to your brain, which is either deeply ironic or quietly perfect, depending on how you look at it. Here's the thing, though. Before we talk about the science, before we get into what is actually happening inside your head when you choose the night over sleep, I want to say something that most conversations about sleep hygiene completely skip over. You are not broken. The fact that you are awake right now, in this particular hour, searching for something or avoiding something, or simply existing in the stillness that the rest of the world has abandoned until sunrise, that is not a character flaw. It is a signal. And signals, when you learn how to read them, tend to be far more interesting than the noise that surrounds them. The quiet misunderstanding. Society has a very specific story about the person who stays up too late. The story goes something like this. They are undisciplined. They lack structure. They probably procrastinate. They know what they should do and they simply do not do it. They need better habits, a stricter bedtime, a morning routine, perhaps a productivity app or a cold plunge at 5 a.m. This story is not entirely wrong, but it is not the full picture either, and the part it leaves out is the part that actually matters. What research in sleep science and behavioral psychology has been quietly revealing for decades is that late-night wakefulness is rarely about laziness. It is rarely even about poor time management. More often, staying up late is a form of emotional regulation that the brain has learned, sometimes in childhood, to rely upon when the day has given it no other window of peace, control, or psychological freedom. The night, for many people, is not a failure. It is a refuge. And that distinction between failure and refuge changes everything about what we should actually do with it. What happens in the first few hours? Let's begin with what is already happening in your body and your brain by the time midnight arrives. Your brain runs on a biological clock that researchers call the circadian rhythm. Think of it less like a clock and more like a tide. It rises and falls across the 24-hour day, pulling your alertness up toward midday and then drawing it slowly back down toward darkness and rest. Around 10 or 11 at night, for most people, the tide is going out. The brain starts releasing melatonin. Core body temperature drops by a small but meaningful fraction. Neural activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of you that reasons, plans, and makes considered decisions, begins to quiet. You are being invited to stop. But you do not stop. You push against the tide. And this is where it gets psychologically interesting. In those early hours past midnight, something shifts. The prefrontal cortex, fatigued and under-resourced, loses a little of its grip. And when the prefrontal cortex loosens its grip, the parts of the brain that govern emotion, impulse, and imagination begin to breathe a bit more freely. This is why so many people report feeling oddly creative or emotionally open late at night. There's a neurological reason for that feeling. It's real. The internal editor has gone to sleep before you have. Benjamin Bloom, the educational psychologist whose work on mastery and learning still shapes how we understand human development, wrote extensively about the importance of affective conditions in learning. He understood that how a person feels, emotionally, physiologically, shapes how deeply they can think.
What sleep deprivation does is quietly corrupt those affective conditions from the inside out in a way that is gradual enough to be almost invisible. You feel more open, but you are actually becoming more reactive, less discerning, and less capable of the kind of deep processing that turns experience into actual understanding. The myth of the night genius. Here's the part where we need to gently dismantle a very seductive myth. There's a romanticized image of the person who stays up late to do their best thinking, the late-night philosopher, the insomniac novelist, the scientist who has a breakthrough at 2 a.m. because the world finally got quiet enough to let the idea surface. This image is real in the sense that it contains emotional truth, but it is misleading in the way that most romanticized things are misleading. It focuses on the beautiful exception and erases the ordinary cost. Feynman, who was one of the most gloriously unconventional thinkers of the 20th century, was deeply curious about how the mind actually works. He understood that insight is not random. It is the product of incubation, a process where the brain continues to work on a problem in the background, below consciousness, while the conscious mind rests or plays. The breakthrough at 2 a.m. is not happening because of the wakefulness. It is happening despite it, or more accurately, because of the deep thinking that came before the sleepless night. This is a crucial distinction. What looks like late-night genius is almost always the result of sustained earlier effort finally surfacing into a window of quiet. The night did not produce the insight. The prior work produced it. The night simply got quiet enough for you to hear it. And what the research on memory consolidation tells us is that the insight you have at 2 a.m., the one that feels so clear and so real, is far less likely to survive in any usable form if the sleep that should follow it does not come. Memory is not recorded in the brain like a video file. It is constructed and reconstructed during sleep, particularly during the deep slow-wave phases and the REM cycles, where emotional memories are processed and integrated. Without those cycles, the insight dissolves. It becomes one of those brilliant ideas you had last night that you can't quite reconstruct in the daylight. Now, let's talk about what accumulates when this becomes a pattern rather than a single night. The brain science here is not gentle. After roughly 17 to 19 hours of wakefulness, which is simply staying up until 1 or 2 in the morning after a 6 a.m. start, your cognitive performance begins to resemble what researchers measure in someone with a blood alcohol content above the legal driving limit. Not because alcohol is involved, but because the prefrontal cortex is that depleted. What declines first is not raw processing speed. What declines first is the very thing that makes human thinking interesting, the ability to notice your own errors, to catch your own biases, to think about your thinking. Howard Gardner, in his work on multiple intelligences, pointed towards something important. Intelligence is not a single variable. It's a constellation of capacities, many of which depend heavily on the quality of the internal environment in which thinking occurs. Sleep deprivation does not reduce all of these capacities equally. It attacks the connective tissue between them, the meta-awareness, the self-monitoring, the emotional attunement that allows different kinds of intelligence to work together. In other words, it doesn't just make you slower, it makes you less integrated, less whole. And here's the part that is almost difficult to write because it is so quietly devastating. One of the first capacities to erode is your ability to accurately judge how impaired you actually are. Studies in cognitive neuroscience have shown repeatedly that people who are significantly sleep-deprived consistently overestimate their own performance. They feel fine. They feel functional. The very sensor that would detect the impairment is itself impaired. This is not a moral failing. This is physiology. But understanding it matters because it changes the nature of the conversation you might be willing to have with yourself.
But let us come back to the question that the science alone cannot answer. Why? Why, knowing all of this, or sensing most of it, do so many people return to the late night again and again? Why does the bed feel too early, the morning too demanding, the darkness too available? Carl Jung had a concept he called the shadow, not in any spooky sense, but in a deeply practical psychological one. The shadow is everything about ourselves that we have not yet had the light and the stillness to examine, the parts we avoid in the busyness of the day, the questions we defer because they are uncomfortable, the feelings we have scheduled for later, which somehow becomes tonight, alone, in the quiet. Night has a particular quality of permission. Permission to feel things without having to immediately resolve them. Permission to be unproductive without an audience. Permission to be uncertain without performance. And this is not unhealthy in its impulse. The impulse toward interiority is deeply human and deeply necessary. What matters is whether the night is being used as genuine recovery or as quiet avoidance. These two things can feel almost identical from the inside, and distinguishing between them takes an honesty that is easier said than achieved. Genuine recovery at night looks like reading something that actually absorbs you, or resting without guilt, or having a conversation that goes somewhere real. Quiet avoidance looks like scrolling to outrun a feeling, or staying up past the point where you are producing or resting, simply because sleep feels like a confrontation with tomorrow. Only you know which one is operating on a given night. And the invitation is not to judge whichever answer surfaces. The invitation is simply to notice it. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the small hours of his own night, because the meditations were never meant to be a public document, understood something about the relationship between self-knowledge and self-governance. He wrote not to impress, but to remind. And what he returned to again and again across the pages was this: what is within my control, and what am I actually choosing right now? Not what am I doing, what am I choosing? The brain, under conditions of sleep deprivation, becomes progressively worse at making this distinction. It responds rather than decides. It reacts rather than acts. The window of intentional choice narrows, and the space where habits, impulses, and emotional patterns operate expands to fill it. This is what sleep as a biological system is actually protecting. Not just your cardiovascular health or your immune function, though it protects those too. It is protecting your capacity for intention, your capacity to be the person who chooses rather than the one who simply responds. Confucius wrote that the man who knows what he is doing and why he is doing it moves through the world with a stillness that is not passivity, but clarity. Sleep is, among other things, a form of neurological housekeeping that restores the conditions in which that clarity is even possible. When the glymphatic system, the brain's cleansing mechanism, runs its deep cycle during sleep, it is literally flushing metabolic waste from between neural cells. The products of a day's thinking, the cellular byproducts of sustained cognitive activity, are carried away. You wake not just rested, but literally cleansed at the cellular level. The thinking you do the next day happens in a cleaner medium. Staying awake night after night is, in this sense, like trying to write on a page that never gets erased. The older marks interfere with the new ones. Patterns that should dissolve persist. Emotional residue accumulates. And what you experience as brain fog or irritability or lack of motivation is often simply the felt sense of a brain trying to think through too many layers of its own unprocessed history. There is one more layer worth exploring because it is the one that sleep hygiene advice almost always misses. James, the psychologist and philosopher, observed that what we do habitually is not just what we practice, it is what we become. Every late night, in a quiet but cumulative way, writes something into the story you tell about yourself. And sometimes that story is protective. The late-night identity for some people carries a sense of individuality, of depth, of not being like everyone else who is unconscious by 10. There is a private pride in the wakefulness, even when the wakefulness is no longer serving any useful function. The question is not whether this identity is right or wrong. The question is whether it is chosen or inherited, whether it was assembled consciously or accumulated through stress and years of using the night as the only available space for yourself. Because if the late night is the only place you feel free, the answer is not simply to go to bed earlier. The answer is to find or build more freedom inside the daylight hours, to create the conditions in which you do not need to steal time from your own recovery. This is slower work than a sleep schedule, but it is more honest. So here is where we arrive after all of this. Staying up all night does not just make you tired, it gradually disconnects you from the version of yourself that thinks clearly, feels accurately, and chooses intentionally. It does this not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, like sediment settling at the bottom of a glass. The water looks clear until the light hits it exactly the right angle. What the brain actually needs from night is not just unconsciousness. It needs the particular kind of darkness where memory is woven together, where emotional experience is processed and filed, where the cellular residue of thinking is cleared away so that something clean can take its place. Sleep is not a surrender to the day. It is the condition that makes the next day coherent. And if you are someone who fights sleep, who stays up not for necessity, but from something harder to name, what you may actually be resisting is not the night itself, but the quiet it holds, the stillness in which you are asked to stop performing, stop producing, stop proving, and simply exist. That is not a weakness, that is a question. And questions, when you are finally rested enough to sit with them, have a way of becoming the most interesting part. So, if something in this video landed, I want you to sit with just one thing before you do anything else. Not a habit, not a new routine, just a question. What have you been using the night to avoid or to protect? Because the answer to that question is closer to the truth of your sleep than any advice about screens or caffeine or bedroom temperature. The science matters, but you matter more than the science. In the next few videos, we are going to go deeper into what the brain does when it is asked to learn under conditions of stress, exhaustion, and distraction. We'll explore why some people feel like they are always behind no matter how hard they work, and what psychology actually suggests about where that feeling comes from. If those questions feel familiar, stay close. There is a kind of self-understanding that does not require you to become a different person. It only asks you to see the one you already are with a little more clarity and a little more compassion. That's what this channel is here for. Good night, or good morning, depending on when you're watching this.